moved back.
You can go ahead and introduce yourself then.
Okay, great. Are we ready to start, everyone?
Yep.
My name is John Fia. Some of you may have, I can't remember how many times I've spoken here now. It's been multiple times over the years. I teach American history at Messiah University. Several people have asked me how's things going at Messiah. I said, I don't know, because I'm on sabbatical this year. So I try to stay away. Messiah is a small college, relatively small college. So when you're on leave and you go back, someone nabs you to do something, right? Or sit in on some committee or something like that. So I try to stay away. Happy 300th anniversary. I know this is part of a lecture series on the 300th anniversary of Derry Church. Hopefully we can add some additional layers to what you've already learned about the history of this congregation. So what I've been tasked to do, or what I've been assigned to do, is to talk the next 2 weeks about Indian relations with Scots-Irish and on the Pennsylvania frontier. And what I thought I would do today is talk a little bit about probably the most sensational, most controversial, most tragic in some ways event that occurred in the 18th century on the frontier. There is a small Derry Church connection, some of you may know, to the Conestoga Massacre. And very small, but still it's there. Much of what I'm going to say today will not focus on Derry Church as much, but there is a kind of macro, there we call it systemic kind of story about Native Americans and Scots-Irish Presbyterians on the frontier. And then next week, I'll be back to talk about a story probably many of you are not familiar with. And this is the story of a Presbyterian itinerant minister named Philip Vickers Fithian, who came out into central Pennsylvania, not necessarily this area, a little farther up the Susquehanna River, and had multiple encounters as well with Native Americans. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of Presbyterianism in this larger region and the way in which Presbyterian supply preachers, basically, although they weren't called that back then, would come and visit some of these communities and encounter Native Americans. Philip Vickers Fithian was the subject of my first book, which I wrote back in 2008. So I'm going to try to draw some of the frontier stuff out of that book and put it into a presentation. But today it is the Conestoga Massacre. Oftentimes this is referred to as the Paxton Boys Massacre, as some of you know it. And I guess it was, 7-8 years ago. I can't actually remember the exact time. There was a big conference on the anniversary. I think it would have been maybe 2014. Would that be the 250th? Yeah. Maybe it's 2013. It was at the Lancaster Historical Society, or I think they call it lancaster.org now. A lot of this stuff is drawn out of a paper I gave at that conference on Presbyterians and the Paxton riots or Conestoga Massacre. I'm not able to cover all of the in-depth research into that study, but if you want a copy of the paper, shoot me an email. I'm happy to send it to you. It's a sort of presentation paper that I read at that conference. Some of the stuff comes out of that, and I've added a few more things here to bring some local flavor to it here for the Derry audience. So, immigrant violence on the Pennsylvania frontier, Scots-Irish Presbyterians, and the Conestoga Massacre. The first thing you need to understand is the larger context of the event, and the larger context is Scots-Irish immigration in the 18th century. Some of you, if you go online, you can find this chart. This comes from Marion Wokeck's book, Trade and Strangers, which is the best book, I think, still on European immigration to America in the 18th century. But you'll notice, between 1730 and 1760, roughly, most of the European immigration to Pennsylvania and the western frontier were Germans, right? I mean, we all know, you live in this area, there's this significant German influence. And the Scots-Irish are I don't know if you want to call it a distant second, but it's mostly Germans and Scots-Irish settling this area. I'm not going to go too into this because I understand you've studied this already in some of your talks here in this 300th anniversary education series. What I want to call your attention to is roughly around the time of the Conestoga Massacre, which occurred in December of 1763, and we'll get into the details of it here in a second. You have to understand that this event happened at the height of Scots-Irish immigration. So finally, by 1760, you have finally the Scots-Irish have surpassed the Germans in terms of immigrants. This is in many ways, the high point of Scots-Irish immigration, roughly around the time that this massacre takes place. And I think that's significant. You have massive amounts of Scots-Irish moving out to the frontier, and you have some developments going on in the wake of the French and Indian War, which are going to kind of meet each other, Native Americans and this massive wave of Scots-Irish. So I think this is worth noting just to begin. About 11,000 new Scots-Irish immigrants, 11,336 coming in this 9-year period in which the Conestoga Massacre is not exactly in the middle, but roughly in the middle of that period. Okay. Again, I'll try to stop at the end for questions. Keep your, I'm sure some of you have some already. So let's get a little more historical background. I said, in many ways, what happened in the Conestoga Massacre is the convergence of a very significant Scots-Irish migration to the Susquehanna River Valley, this area. But at the same time, there are things going on in the Native American world in the wake of the end of the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War ends in 1763. This was a war between, I always tell my students, the French and Indian War was named by the British, right? So they're fighting the French and the Indians, right? I have to tell them this was not a war, between the French and the Indians. And it also was that too. It gets a little complicated. So many of the Algonquin-speaking Indian tribes in this region, Great Lakes region here, fought in the French and Indian War for the French, on the side of the French. And there were other Indians who fought on the English side. But we're concerned about these French supporters. In 1763, when the war ended, the Treaty of Paris is going to give all of this territory, or much of this territory here around the Great Lakes, where Detroit is today, which was French territory, the treaty is going to give it to the English. So you're going to have English settlers beginning to move into this area even before the war is over, right? Now, many of the Indians who fought with the French, particularly this Indian leader named Pontiac, is very, very upset about the fact that these English people are moving out west, and they are going to do something to resist, basically by attacking English forts in the area between, say, Detroit and, the Susquehanna River over here. So Indians are on the move. Some of the Lenni Lenape Indians, the Shawnee Indians from the Ohio region, many of them are moving east and continuing to attack these various forts. So down here, you're talking, like Fort Bedford, you're talking about Cumberland County, right? So they're not only out here in Fort Pitt, Pittsburgh, and so forth, but they're moving, they're moving into this region where we are right now. And they are attacking these forts, and in the process, kind of collateral damage of this, they're also attacking homes of some of these settlers. So again, go back to my original comment here. Massive Scots-Irish immigrant, relatively speaking, coming in. At the same time, Many of the Lenni Lenape and Shawnee and other former French supporters are moving east to push back English settlement, or at least to destroy the English forts. So most of these little crowns you see here are English forts. So you can't understand the Paxton boys or the Conestoga Massacre without understanding this greater context. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Conestoga, the Native Americans known as the Conestoga. There really is no Conestoga tribe. The Conestoga were a kind of mixed group of Lenape Indians. There were some Iroquois. Many of them had the Iroquois had claims on this land. Whatever the case, a lot of these Indians were settling in this area known as Conestoga Manor, or which would later become known as Conestoga Manor. In 1701, Onas, which was the name that these Indians referred to or called William Penn. Onas is the Lenape word for feather, because he made them sign a treaty with a feathered pen. So they started calling him Onas. Onas, and by the way, they would also refer to William Penn's children as Onas, the Penn family, sets aside 500 acres in 1701 for these Conestoga Indians. Again, a mixture of Susquehannock, Lenape, Shawnee, and Iroquois Indians. I just pulled out a quote from the treaty, which says, quote, "Neither side would," technically that quotation mark shouldn't be there, sorry. "Neither side would hurt, injure, or defraud the other, nor commit any act of hostility or violence." Right? So again, knowing what happened, right? It's interesting reference there. And the Conestoga Indians, for the most part, took this seriously. They saw Penn as their great protector, the Penn family as their great protectors, the province of Pennsylvania, the colony of Pennsylvania as their great protectors. After the massacre took place, some of the Scots-Irish who were in there came in after the massacre, actually found a copy of the original treaty that they had possessed. It was such a prized possession to the Conestoga. Continuing the story here with the Conestoga, in 1718, James Logan, who was the secretary to the Penn family, created a 16,000-acre plot known as Conestoga Manor, and mostly sold off pieces of this plot to some of those Scots-Irish settlers. In other words, massive immigration coming in, not as much as in 1760, but as you saw, there were still, thousands of Scots-Irish coming in, so maybe I'll take the word massive away there. And they wanted to buy land. And, as much as we think of William Penn as a wonderful man of peace and, created these alliances with the Indians, Penn wanted to make money. The Penn family wanted to make money. So they were happy to sell a lot of this Conestoga Manor region to Europeans. There were some Germans who settled in there too, not just Scots-Irish. But yet, in order to honor the 1701 treaty, they still kept 500 acres. The original 500 acres of this land would be Conestoga land that could not be settled by white Europeans. Right? So that's another important dimension to this story. Fast forward to 1763, at the time of the massacre. You have the population, virtually no Conestoga are living in this region, but yet there are people there, or else there couldn't be a massacre. So there's a population in 1763 of 7 men, 5 women, 8 children. They are mostly living in poverty. And in order to make money, in order to get food and trade, they are mostly selling brooms and baskets. And in fact, a significant portion of them, at the time of the first phase of the massacre, were off selling brooms and baskets. and that saved their lives, at least for the moment, if you know the story. So in December of 1763, 50 men, probably all Scots-Irish, since we don't know who they were, and we have no clue about these men. We'll talk about that in a second here. Attack the Indian village in Conestoga Manor. They kill and scalp 6, which was basically everyone present on the manor. And the rest of the group that is out selling the brooms and the baskets, they are taken away and brought to Lancaster, where they're put in the workhouse, or the jail there, for their own protection, because they believe the Paxton boys are going to come after them as well. Okay, so there is the story. December 13th, 14th was the massacre, the first massacre. On December 27th, here's an early sketch of the Lancaster Workhouse on King Street in Lancaster. There are 14 Conestogas being held there for their own protection. It's a Sunday morning. There is an Anglican service going on right down the street, so everybody's in church. It's snowing, according to reports, and that is when these 50 Scots-Irish men arrive at the workhouse, break in, and kill the remaining Conestoga. Now, one of the reasons that they do this, and we'll get into their motivations here in a second, but one of the reasons they do this is they believe that the Conestoga Indians, as poor and as sparse as their population is somehow working with some of the stronger Indian tribes like the Susquehannocks, the Lenape, even tribes out in the east, in Northampton County and places like that, who are fighting against or burning down these British forts. As far as historians are able to tell, there is absolutely zero evidence to suggest that the Conestoga Indians were working with these larger native tribes, but at the time, this is what was believed by the Scots-Irish. So just some pictures. Has anyone ever visited the Fulton Opera House in Lancaster? That is where the workhouse is today. The Fulton Opera House sits above the workhouse. These are just some pictures that I took several years ago when I was kind of just poking around the historical sites. This is the back of the Opera House, and this would have been the doors to the, I think this is a modern door, but this would have been where the door to the workhouse would have been. I actually had a student who wrote a paper on the Paxton boys and the Conestoga Massacre, and she managed to convince the people to they don't give tours, but she managed to convince them to let her go in there. I mean, there's nothing, it looks like a normal kind of 18th century basement. There's nothing exciting about the place. There is a plaque in there. So again, zero in here on, I think it was the conference that I was mentioning earlier that actually, I didn't join them, but a bunch of folks went to the site and put this kind of little ceremony and put this this plaque on the outside, so you can see exactly where it was located. Of course, this would have been the site of phase 2 of the Conestoga Massacre, right? The Lancaster portion of it. You sometimes, if you Google this, if you Google Paxton, you'll see this picture. This is a 1841 rendering of it. It is just I put this up here just to warn you. I mean, this is not historically accurate. This doesn't represent it. I mean, these look like Victorian era Brits, beating up taking their axes and so forth to the Indians and scalping them. But just so you know, sometimes you'll see this and people say, I'll see things online or something, and people will say, oh, this is what it looked like, right? The bottom line is we don't know what would have happened, other than the fact of reports that suggest that it was quite brutal, including one historian calling it flipping the term savage onto the Presbyterians, the white Scots-Irish. And then I just thought I'd give you a picture of the Fulton Opera. It's at the front of the Fulton Opera House, right? Some of you have been there or seen The image that I had on the first slide was the site, at least the proposed site of the actual first phase, the Conestoga Manor attack. There's a plaque there. So that's what happened. You can read what I just said on Wikipedia. You can, there's not a whole lot of, you can look up that information yourself. I'm not, I want to dig in a little bit with you today. And go a little deeper into what happened, why it happened. Maybe was there a Presbyterian role in all of this? And I don't just mean Scots-Irish, I mean Presbyterian, religious. I think these are the three best interpretations. There are some other ones that are good. There's a guy, he was a Lancaster news reporter named Jack Brubaker, who wrote a really interesting book about it. Who has some interpretations as well. These are the three best scholarly interpretations. The first one is Peter Silver, Our Savage Neighbors, How Indian War Transformed Early America. Silver is he also spoke at that conference I was telling you about. I think he teaches at Rutgers these days. But Silver won the famous Bancroft Prize, which is the highest prize you could win for a book in American history, probably next to the Pulitzer. And this made a lot of waves, this book, when it came out, because he was the first one to talk seriously about the role of race in the Paxton riots, and really focused his book on race. And what Silver argued was that Pennsylvania was supposed to be a place, as William Penn had envisioned it, where all kinds of people, whether they be white, red, black, could get along and live in peace, a peaceable kingdom, a holy experiment, right? And he argues against older historians who continue to put forth that idea that it wasn't anything like that at all. And he uses the Paxton riots, among other things, to make his point. Silver's story is a story of white fear. In other words, a fear that, a legitimate fear, he would say, that these people are going to lose their lives from Indian attacks. And as a result, because of the fear of these attacks, they were so obsessed by this fear that it led to violence. It led to them acting in a violent manner to protect themselves, their culture, their ethnicity, their whiteness, if you will, according to Silver. And in other words, they sort of, and this is a sort of scholarly term, but I'll try to explain it, they otherized the Native Americans. And eventually, by the time you get to the American Revolution, there was a renewed unity within Pennsylvania, but it was a unity of mostly white people who had already, due to the Paxton riots and other events, had seen themselves as ethnically and racially different from Native Americans. And as a result, for the first time in Pennsylvania's history, when much of the frontier united on behalf of independence in 1776, they were finally unified, right? So the unification moment came in 1776, but it wouldn't have happened in 1776 if the Paxton riots had not occurred and Scots-Irish had not otherized and formed unity around their race, white. Again, this is the view, right? You can fight me, argue with me, but and it's not that Silver ignores other things, but this is the primary view, right, of his book. I think the best book on the riots is Kevin Kenny's book, Peaceable Kingdom Lost. It's a good narrative. If you want to read a good book, this is where you should probably start with Kenny's book. Kenny really sees, as Silver kind of brings out these big questions of race and, even goes too far to say that, the othering of Indians, this is the first sign of like whiteness as an ethnicity, right? Kenny is very interested in just kind of telling the story as a Pennsylvania story, right? Again, peaceable kingdom, Penn's kingdom, right? Remember that Hicks painting with Penn and the treaty with the Indians, right? That gets passed around as if this was like a great place in which people got along and everyone. So in some ways he's borrowing from some of Silver's things, but it's a story of Scots-Irish people coming to, and Kenny is a historian of the Scots-Irish, both in Europe, in the United Kingdom, and here. So he's interested in the way Scots-Irish are trying to become more British. They're trying to get property rights. They want to protect their property, like any good person, good landowner would, and points to the sort of differences between that understanding of land as property and the Native American understanding as land in terms of use. Native Americans didn't think of private property. If the land was useful, it was available for everyone to use, right? No one particularly owned it. So I think this is, while it's a straight narrative, this is more of a Pennsylvania story than a kind of universal story like Silver. Although a lot of similarities between the books. Kenny doesn't ignore the racial issues, but it's not his central premise. The third one, Patrick Griffin, Ireland's Ulster Scots, America's Scots-Irish, and the creation of a British Atlantic world. He is very much interested in the story of the Paxton Rides as a transatlantic story, if you want to call it that, right? And you have the British who are reaching the pinnacle of their power, if you will, in the Western world. In 1763, they defeat, formally at least, defeat the French, right? All of those tyrannical, backward, this is their words, tyrannical, this is the people at a time where if someone was walking by and didn't know what was going on, they'd be shocked at what I'm about to say. But this was these tyrannical, backward, superstitious, hellbound Catholics, right? That, again, you can't see what I mean about the context, that were defeated by the British, who were the champions of liberty, right? Britain had a parliament, right? Britain had checks on the king. British people had rights, right? And what he argues is, this is a story of the British, Scots-Irish, I should say, settlers in Western Pennsylvania, or the frontier, I should say, wanting to become full-blown British citizens. By exerting their rights, they want their rights protected. And they feel that the government of Pennsylvania, which is controlled by who? Does anyone know?
Penn's sons.
Who are what? Quakers, right? Actually, Penn's son becomes an Anglican. But the legislature, right? Who are Quakers, are not protecting their rights as British subjects living in a British colony. Right? Now, they want money for self-defense. They want representation in the assembly, even though they have not formed, formal legislative units yet. And their view is the Quakers are, because of their pacifism, right, are not willing to help them fight the Indians because the Quaker legislature is hesitant to give money to military things. So this is why they are strongly pushing for a royal government, the Quaker family to get out, put the government of Pennsylvania under the king, and have a traditional British system where the rights of all people are protected, and they're going to, provide money for them on the frontier to fight against the Native Americans. So, Ben Franklin, is also, he's not a Scots-Irish, he's not an Anglican, he's not a Quaker, but Ben Franklin is also supportive of the rights of the British rights of all of these settlers out on the frontier. He wants a royal government too, or as well. So this is the story of Patrick Griffin. Less a story about race, less a story about, Pennsylvania property rights. So you could say property rights is also part of those rights, right? So again, there's an overlap. But the main story is the Scots-Irish want to become British. They want to become full-fledged members of the British Empire, and that comes with rights and liberties. So much of the Paxton riots is we feel, we should be able to have just as much right to defend ourselves, to fight against these threats than as any British subject should, right? So again, these are the three big interpretations of the event. Again, a lot of overlap between the three, but these are, I always love to give resources, right? I would probably go, if I were good, if you want to read all three, I would probably go 1, 2, 3, because Griffin, the Paxton riots play just, I think, a chapter in Griffin's book. They're covered much more in the other two books, especially this one, which is all about the Paxton riots. So, how about this? I'm sorry about this image. I googled Presbyterians and something, and this came, I think it was Presbyterians in Paxton or something, this came up. Is there a Presbyterian spin on the Paxton riots? Where do Presbyterians, now again, I'm trying here to pull apart, which is often difficult to do, Scots-Irish and Presbyterian. Even though they were all Scots-Irish pretty much were Presbyterian, right? But sometimes Presbyterians acted in an ethnic kind of cultural way. Sometimes they acted in a specifically religious, theological kind of way. Or did they? That's what I want to look at here. So, this is where this guy comes in. Some of you are familiar with him. John Elder. John Elder was the minister of the Paxton Presbyterian Church. You can still see it today. It's still, I want to say the oldest standing. Is it? Is there one earlier?
Well, the oldest standing.
The oldest standing Presbyterian church in Pennsylvania.
The building.
Yeah, the building itself. I think Derry, I'm sensing there's some kind of issue here. But it's the building, I should say. Sorry, wrong crowd. Usually people that just go, no one cares. But yeah, the building is the oldest, I think, in Pennsylvania. There we go, we got that settled. Elder is minister. It doesn't really matter for this discussion, but this is an old light congregation. During the Great Awakening, they opposed the revivals, while Derry, under Reverend John Doane, actually was the New Light congregation, which supported the revivals. He was often referred to as the Fighting Parson. I'm not sure if we have no evidence from the time period of someone calling him the Fighting Parson. Much of that comes from like late 18th and early 19th century historians who called him that. So, it's interesting, and there's all kinds of other accounts of, people bringing guns to church all the time because of the Indians. Again, this is all 19th century, what we call hagiography. I'm not sure what to make of it. I don't think there's any kind of 18th century evidence, manuscript evidence, or newspaper evidence or whatever to suggest that they were actually carrying guns. I deal with a similar situation in New Jersey with this fighting parson named James Caldwell from Elizabethtown, New Jersey, who was said to carry, a gun like right here on the pulpit, to protect himself against the British or something. Elder was also a military commander. The Penns had commissioned him to form a military company to fight the Indians. So again, you have to think about the role of a minister in the 18th century frontier. Elder is probably one of the only educated people on the frontier. He is not only a religious leader, he is a civic leader, he is a military leader. People look to him for all kinds of things. So again, he's going to lead many in his congregation, we assume, into these companies to fight the Indians. And he's going to, of course, become a major player if you want to look at this from the Presbyterian angle. Now, after the first attack on the Conestoga Indians, John Elder writes a letter to John Penn. You can actually go read these letters if you're really interested. Go over to the Dauphin County Historical Society in Harrisburg. It sits right behind the John Harris Mansion there on, what's the road? Front Street. You can read these letters. I read these letters looking for tons of stuff that I didn't find, and I was hoping to find, but I'll talk about that in a second. But there is this letter from John Elder to John Penn. And again, I can't remember if this letter is at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and they just have a copy at the Dauphin County. Again, my memory escapes me. But it's clear from this letter that John Elder knew that this massacre was coming before it came. He was not involved with it, or at least that's what he claims. Most historians have taken him at his word. But he knew something. By the way, I should have added, here's the connection to Derry, right? As some of you historians in the room know. Many of the Derry congregants during the First Great Awakening in the 1730s and 40s went over to Paxton Church because they didn't like the evangelical revivalist preaching of Doane and his side in the Great Awakening. And then I believe, if my history is right, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, Elder then later in his life returns here and pastors after the 1758 reunion, maybe 1768.
Roan will stay here until he dies in 1774,
and then Elder comes. But it's after the 1768 reunion of the old side and the new side, so that kind of it's okay for him to come back now, right? The church has reunited again. Although Derry would always have, as I understand it, a kind of new side flavor to it because of the influence of Doane, right? So Elder's around for a long time. What is he, the pastor here till like the 1790s when he dies, right? So this guy's a fixture of kind of Presbyterian life, along this part of the Susquehanna River. I mean, he's a very, very important person in a variety of ways here. But he knows that this is going to happen. Then afterwards, the correspondence with Elder and Penn. Penn, by the way, John Penn is the governor of Pennsylvania, right, at this point. I want to say grandson of William Penn. Look at this first letter, and for some reason I don't have the date on there. I don't know why, but take all the pain. This is Penn to Elder. Take all the pains in your power to learn the names of the ringleaders and perpetrators of those barbarites, and to acquaint me with everything you can discover concerning them. Elder never responds to John Penn's request. We can't prove this, but this guy has to know just about everyone who was involved in the massacres, and he never gives up the names, at least in terms of what we have available to us in extant records. Maybe something will show up someday, I don't know. But there is never a time where Elder gives the names. But from the next letter here, January 27th, it's clear that he knows these people. So listen to this. The storm which had been so long gathering has at length exploded. Had government, and by this point, by the way, I don't want to get into the full story, but by this point, the Paxton boys are actually now moving towards Philadelphia to capture a bunch of Moravian Indians who are in the jail there because they think they've been participating with the Shawnee, and the Susquehannock attacks, right? So that's a whole other, they have the city of Philadelphia on guard, right? It's hilarious to see all these Quakers, like there's comments about, oh my gosh, these Quakers know nothing about how to defend a city, they're pacifists. But they're all there trying to fumbling them, and it must have been like a Keystone Cops situation. They hear that the Paxton boys are coming, they get reports and they're fumbling to learn how to use a cannon and, all this kind of stuff as they're waiting. There's a great image of that. You can find it if you Google it, of them preparing for the attack. But again, that's later in the story. But again, the storm which had been so long gathering has at length exploded. Had government removed the Indians, which had been frequently but without effect, urged this painful catastrophe might have been avoided. So immediately, Elder is blaming the Quakers. If you had helped us, if you had done something to help us remove these people, we could have avoided this. Right? What could I do with men heated to madness? So in other words, look, I tried to stop them as I read this, right? But they were hot-headed, they were emotional, they were mad, right? Mad meaning psychologically, kind of mad. And they were probably mad too, but no other way. All that I could was done. All that I could do was done. I expostulated, but I love that. I expostulated. Like, what does that mean? Like, he preached a sermon to them? What did he do to try to stop them? But life and reason were set at defiance. Yet the men in now this is where a lot of historians are, put heavy blame on Elder. And, he couldn't have gotten away with any of this in sort of the 21st century, right? He says, yet the men in private life are virtuous and respectable, right? These are good people. These are good men who just killed 14 Conestoga Indians and are now charging on Philadelphia, right? And this is where people like Patrick Griffin, start to take them seriously. They're good men. They want their rights. They just want help. They're being attacked by Indians, right? They're just doing this to gain what any other good British person should be able to have, peace and freedom. And their government coming to their aid when they're getting attacked by Indians, right? These are good men, respectable, not cruel, but mild and merciful. The time, again, it's easy to superimpose our 21st century understanding of this event on the moment. And, history is sometimes not about just moral criticism. Sometimes it is, and maybe in this case it is, but sometimes history is about understanding. You can understand that Elder does truly believe that these people are good, moral people who are just trying to protect themselves and their families and not agree with what happened, right? But I want to try to get you at least to think inside of the mind of Elder. Now again, maybe some of you are already thinking like Elder, and you need to think like the Conestoga, right? So sometimes we walk in all kinds of shoes, and we have all kinds of empathy when it comes to this kind of stuff. The time will arrive when each palliating circumstance will be weighed. This deed, magnified into the blackest of crimes, shall be considered as one of those ebullitions of wrath caused by momentary excitement to which human infirmity is subjected. So there's a good Presbyterian, right? Human sin, right? Calvinist. It's expected. This is the way human beings sometimes behave because of human infirmities that we were, you could almost read this as like, that original sin or our depraved nature of some sort. But it's a one-off, right? There's not a systemic problem here, right? Like Peter Silver would say, there's a largely systemic racism problem. There's not a systemic problem here. It's just a bunch of bad apples. You ever hear this before? Right? It's just a few bad apples who got overheated, and this is what happened. What do you expect? We're all sinners, right? Kind of thing. Again, you could apply that kind of rhetoric to a variety of things that have happened in the United States in the last 10 years, 5-10 years, right? Nothing new here on that front. So, last point I want to make here, and that is related to, get even deeper into the theological here. Were the Paxton boys motivated to do this by some kind of larger religious worldview? Some kind of theological or biblical understanding of the Native Americans, of race, of, those kinds of things. Well, after this event took place, there was a massive, I keep using that word, but this was massive, for the time, pamphlet war over what happened. All different sides were taken, apart from the First Great Awakening, when people wrote art, people like Jonathan Edwards and Gilbert Tennant, and these people wrote these pamphlets defending or rejecting the Great Awakening. There was no greater influx of published pamphlets about any episode in colonial America, second to the Great Awakening, than the pamphlet war, it was often referred to, that occurred after the event took place. Ben Franklin jumps in. Ben Franklin basically said that the Paxton Boys were motivated by Old Testament ideas of claiming the promised land, is his argument. Essentially, right, the Paxton Boys, the Scots-Irish, the Presbyterians and this is what they would have learned in their churches, right? That they are occupying the land like the Israelites in the Old Testament, and the Native Americans were in some ways some of these tribes that they had to rid from the promised land. I think Franklin specifically talks about Joshua in the pamphlet, right? In that argument. There are several who use this term, the arm of God was with them. In other words, most of these are, of course, non-Presbyterians who don't like Scots-Irish Presbyterians, who say they are motivated, Quakers and Anglicans, they were motivated by God to drive these people these Native Americans out of Pennsylvania, or their land. One pamphlet described them to Samuel, sending King Saul to destroy the Amalekites. Story in 1 Samuel 15. Again, you can read all of these pamphlets. They're all, actually, most of them are online. Are you familiar with the Digital Paxton Project? Google that, Digital Paxton. This Philadelphia historian has collected all of everything written about the Paxton Boys. It's all in one website. You can read all this, and not in the document form. He's transcribed them in normal English, right, to read. So again, you could research all of this for itself. I'm just giving like the tip of the iceberg of the religious ways in which the opponents of the Paxton Riot saw this. At the end of the 18th century, Robert Proud became the first major historian of Pennsylvania. He wrote a history of Pennsylvania in 1797. And here's just one phrase. He says the Paxton Boys used the, quote, pretense of religion to cover their barbarity. Now, you need to take these pamphlets, you need to interpret these pamphlets. You need to understand these pamphlets in context. None of the pro-Paxton pamphlets show any inkling that this was that they were motivated by theology or the Bible. There's nothing. In fact, this is what I was talking about with the elder papers. About 10 years ago, I went into the Dauphin County Historical Society, convinced that I was going to read these elder papers. There's a bunch of letters, there's sermons by elder, convinced that I was going to find all of these biblical and theological, God wants us to destroy these Indians. Here, this verse, that verse, this story, that story. I found nothing. Elder never mentions anything. I mean, he preaches their sermons, but they're not about this, right? His letters about it, nothing about this kind of in a religious or theological motivation, which I was mad about that because that's what I wanted to find, right? But sometimes you go to these archives, and part of the process of being a historian is you eliminate things, right? That's not there, right? And then you have to change your kind of working assumption of things. So if this was theologically motivated, I would argue that it very well could have been, but a lot of these anti-Paxton Boys pamphlets also were people with axes to grind. There was we can't go into this, but there was a whole political dimension to this. This is what I talked about in that paper, of the Presbyterian Party which was a political party in Pennsylvania that was trying to drive the Quakers out of control. So it was, many of these Quakers who were wanting to stay, the colony to stay under Quaker control and not allow it to become a royal colony, like I mentioned earlier, who were using religion to discredit. Well, these are just a bunch of Calvinists, and Calvinists want to control everything. They want to take over the colony. They want to, blah, blah. So I think there were a lot of things going on. Again, if you want to read my paper, let me know. But there were a lot of politics involved here, and religion was being used. How about that? Religion being used for political ends. Religion is being used for political ends here to kind of make these Presbyterians look like somehow they were spiritually motivated, right? Were they? Weren't they? All I can say is, there's no smoking gun. We can't prove that they were using biblical and theological ideas to justify killing. Now, you could make a kind of more macro systemic argument that, like Silver does, that the otherness of the Indians, the racialized nature of the Indians are inferior, the Indians are an inferior race. That was probably in the air. Some of that stuff had been promoted and endorsed by Christians, at the time. But, that's much more of a kind of, this was the air they breathed kind of argument, which is true. But for a historian, I guess I want to see the details. I want to see the document. Right? And there's really nothing. Now, I'm not trying to make you feel good or bad here about, we're off the hook or, whatever. Because, the relationship between history and the past and the present is a very complicated and complex one, as I hope you're learning through this 300th year anniversary celebration. But, it's Elder is a complicated figure. I'll just leave it at that. He clearly knows what's going on. He clearly doesn't, did he do everything he could to stop it? We'll never know. I mean, there's a lot of mystery still involved in this whole event. So, in conclusion, here's that Hicks painting, right, that I showed you. In some ways, the history of 18th century Pennsylvania is really one of division, death, war, battles between politicians, religious groups, and so forth. The actual story of Pennsylvania is, probably much more complicated and certainly not as sort of pie in the sky as Hicks would like us to perceive it. So I'll stop there. We've got about 10 minutes, and I'm sure you have questions. I hope you have questions. But again, this lecture just kind of touches the surface. I think I wanted to at least leave with you here today, giving you some resources if you want to dig deeper, right? Some books to read, some websites to check out, those kinds of things. Questions? We have till 10:15, right? Yeah. Yes.
I've always been a little confused by the second massacre in
Yeah.
Lancaster, in that it seemed like, although they were being protected in Lancaster, there wasn't a big, uprising to protect them. What was the relationship between the Scots-Irish and the Swiss-German population of Lancaster?
Yeah.
Was there?
Yeah. Most other Protestant denominations, and the Anglicans too, had very, very bad relations with the Scots-Irish. Yeah, the Scots-Irish were, and this is where it gets really, really interesting. Peter Silver's book talks about this. Many, especially English, if there was a kind of, who looked down upon who because of their ethnicity kind of scale, I mean, the English obviously saw themselves as the most civilized. They saw themselves as the Anglican Church as the most civilized and historic denomination. It was the one true church for Protestants, right? There were a lot of Europeans in the Catholic Church who would have disagreed with that, but they had the bishops and then they looked down upon all of the other religions as dissenters who were not part of it. They broke away from the true church. The Germans, and this doesn't apply just to the Swiss Germans, but this would apply to kind of most non-Anabaptist Germans. So what I mean by that is Lutherans, right? German Reformed. The Anabaptists always kind of just kept to themselves. I'm talking like Mennonites, the descendants of the Amish. When I talk about, if you're not familiar with that phrase, term Anabaptists, like effort a cloister type people, So the Germans looked down. The non-Mennonite Germans looked down on the Scots-Irish as well. And they often, because of the long history of Ireland being a penal colony and all of these kinds of European issues, many often use the term, English, I don't know about the Germans, but English often use the term savages to describe the Scots-Irish, right? So Silver unpacks this, but this gets into a really complicated situation because for many of especially the English religious settlers of this region, there is very little difference. Now there is a difference, but there's very little difference between the Native Americans and the Scots-Irish. They're both like inferior groups. Now what Silver's going to argue is it's this event where the English, the German, and the Scots-Irish, out of a threat, because of the Indian threat, begin to break down those differences and unite around their common race, whiteness. Again, we could break that Anglo-Saxon, German, right? So it's this event that is going to essentially unify these three groups, these three white groups, and the Indians are the other. But prior to this, Scots-Irish are often seen as just a little bit above the Indians, right? Again, that's his argument. It seems pretty, and he makes a pretty compelling case of it.
Reminds me of the Southern strategy.
Yeah, it could be the Southern strategy. You could think of it in terms of, in the 17th century in Virginia, when with slavery, when all the poor whites and the black and the elite whites got together and brought in all the slaves, so there would always be, there's all these kinds of, race kind of politics involved here. But that's what Silver argues, and it's pretty good. It's pretty convincing because he takes the story all the way up through the American Revolution, and by that point, the denominational differences have now given way to a common whiteness and a common, back to Patrick Griffin, a common pursuit of liberties, right? That these differences are no longer important. And he would argue it's the Paxton riots that was the pivotal moment that happened. Yeah. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Yeah.
The Scots-Irish came here because they were put down in their own countries.
Yeah.
They always were promised this, but it never happened.
Well, that's the whole point of why they were inferior.
And then they came here. But they came here because once again, they were promised, you do this, this will happen. But the government wasn't supporting them. So now they're coming out with, okay, government, you're ignoring us. We're gonna show you that we can do things.
That's the back to those three books. That's the Patrick Griffin argument, a people with no name, right? They were a people with no name. They had no real unity. They had no real connection, and the Quakers didn't care about them. The Quakers, English, looked down upon them as they didn't protect them on the frontier. And as a result, they said, hey, we'll take matters into our own hands. It's sort of, that kind of justice, right? Frontier justice, if you want to call it that, right? And, and then, when I teach this to students, I usually have half the class, it's like, who wouldn't?
But
Like, I don't want some Native American, just randomly coming in and killing my wife and kids. Where's the government to help me? Where I need to form more militias. Give me more power. Give me more money. I have to protect my family.
Don't we see this as we move west? It happened in Texas, it happened in
Yeah.
California, it happened in the
Well,
Northwest.
it's a pretty traditional,
Yeah.
traditional story. I think what makes the Paxton riots interesting is it's one of the earliest
Yeah.
where you see this.
It repeats, it repeats.
It repeats over and over again, yeah. I mean, back in the these are a bunch of white, frontier, poor people who feel their rights are being taken away. And they are going to turn to whoever the strong man is. Is it John Elder? Is it a New York businessman?
Has
I don't know.
Silver,
Who's the strong man? Who's gonna protect them against all this change that's happening, right?
has Silver done anything recently kind
No. I wish he would.
of,
He disappeared. Silver's interesting because it's not getting into sort of historian shop talk here, but Silver disappears like after he writes his book. He's still teaching and everything at Rutgers, but I don't think he's published a book since then. And this book won every award possible. And then maybe he's published one more book, but yeah.
I'm gonna ask a question that's gonna put my ignorance on full display here. And maybe perhaps a naive thing to think about here, but you've given me a lot to think about as an elder, about Elder as a person.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to reconcile in my head, 300th anniversary, we've got a room named after this guy here.
Oh, you do? I didn't know.
and a chapel.
And
Courtney in
that's-
her next article argues we shouldn't lift up John Elder as much as we should lift up William Bertram.
Well, to that point, I'm trying to reconcile here, and you've read some of his sermons. I'm trying to reconcile here, is this an individual